Want to give a shout out to all of my patrons. Thank you so much for all of the continued support. Hey everybody, I am back with part 2 of my top fantasy books according to my viewers series. This time we're going to be covering books number 80 through 61. If you didn't catch up with the first video, I will put that link right up above. But essentially, I went out and asked all my viewers to rank what their top fantasy books are of all time. Not fantasy series, but books. I had hundreds and hundreds of responses from different people with thousands of individual responses, so I let them vote up to 10 times, and these are those results. If you want to talk in more detail about these, please join me on my Discord channel. It is the fastest growing and best adult fantasy Discord around, and that link is right down below in the description. So let's start right now with the list, starting with number 80. This had 13 votes, and this is Magician. Magician is the first of 3 of the first trilogy in the Rift War saga by Raymond E. Feist. And this is a series that I just recently started reading. This first book is split up into 2 different books. The voters viewed this as one, but I think originally it came out as one book, and then later on it got split into 2. I gave the first book a 5 out of 5, and I gave the second one a 4.5 out of 5. Overall, though, I loved it. This is old school fantasy story with very classic tropes. This is essentially about a boy who's training to become a wizard amid this backdrop of an alien invasion. It uses this alien invasion thing really very smart in a way that, even though this book came out, I think in the early 80s, I haven't read a series that's really picked up on that trope in the same way that was done here, because it just had this really cool mix of kind of a fantasy and this kind of sci-fi element to it, with this really classic take on it that felt like a kind of more modern day Lord of the Rings. And in my opinion, it's a better book than the Lord of the Rings is. Not in terms of historical relevance by any stretch of the imagination, but if you read them both today, I find this one to be more enjoyable. Then at number 71, we are jumping to 71 because we have a 9-way tie. So let's start that 9-way tie. This is with 14 votes, and the first one is American Gods. American Gods is a standalone by Neil Gaiman, and this is essentially about this character where days before his release from prison, this man's wife dies in a mysterious car crash, and on his way home, he encounters this really weird guy who claims to be a refugee from this distant war, and is like a former god and the king of America. Then together they embark on this profoundly strange journey across the heart of the USA. I did not enjoy this book. I didn't really give it a great chance, though. I DNF'd it at about 20% way through. I like fantasy, but the fantasy elements here, they just didn't really appeal to me as a reader. It just felt very weird and strange and not compelling to me. And in general, I think a lot of people like this kind of weird kind of fantasy stuff. And that's just not for me. I like it a little bit more straightforward. And yeah, this one was anything but. So another one in that 9-way tie at number 71 with 14 votes is Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. This book is number 7 of 7, the final one in the series of Harry Potter. And this is of course, by J.K. Rowling. I did not read this one. I never made it this far into the movies either. I did watch the movies, but never quite got there. I think I made it to book 5 or 6. In this one, Harry's been burdened with a dark and dangerous and seemingly impossible task, and that is of destroying Voldemort's remaining Horcruxes. And Harry's never felt so alone or faced a future full of so much shadows and mystery. But Harry has to find it within himself, the strength to complete the task that he's been given. I hope to read this in the future with my daughter over the next several years. We are very slowly prodding through the first one, but she's getting more into it, so I hope that eventually I get to this point. Then at number 71 again is Wizard and Glass. This is book number 4 of 8 of The Dark Tower by Stephen King, and another one that I have not read. I have read the first Dark Tower book, and the second one I'm going to be reading rather soon. This is one of 2 Dark Tower books that are going to show up on this list. The second one will show up later. And so I read the first Dark Tower book recently. I did not enjoy it at all. I gave it a 2 out of 5. It just felt very strange and directionless. But I am committed to reading the next one in the series. In general, the Dark Tower tells the story of Roland Deschain. He is the last gunslinger of this world who's traveling southeast across this post-apocalyptic landscape, searching for this powerful but elusive magical edifice known as the Dark Tower. And so, yeah, I think the next one is either the next audiobook I'm listening to or the one after that. So hopefully the series picks up for me and I can get to enjoying it like so many other people do. Next up in that 9-way tie is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is book number 1 of 8 of the Chronicles of Narnia. This is by C.S. Lewis. I haven't read this one since like the 5th grade or 4th grade or something like that. It was required reading back then. I don't know if it still is. But I loved it at the time. I tried it recently to read this to my daughter, and it just didn't quite click. The writing is just very old, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But for a little, I think she was 5 when I started reading it to her, it was just a little too advanced. And I kept having to change what words were being said to make it into more modern style English, but I'll try again at some point because I really liked it. It's the story, I'm sure you know it because this is a super popular series, but it's about these 4 kids who find out that the back of the wardrobe at this house they're staying in transport them to this magical world of talking animals and mythical creatures that's ruled by the evil White Witch. I think I read the first 3, but then lost interest. Apparently there's a lot of Christian themes in this story. Back then when I was reading it, I just had no idea about that. And yeah, so I'm very happy this one's on the list though, because it's not one that I very often find on top fantasy books, on modern day type of lists. So next up in that 9-way tie is The Grace of Kings. This is book 1 of 4 of the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. And this is one of the greatest books that I've ever read. And I would give this a 6 out of 5 if my numbers went up that high. I read this very recently, within the last couple months. And this is through the story. This is follows the Chu Han contention period. This is right before the Han Dynasty. This is a reimagining that also draws on Western traditions. This is a lightning fast fantasy book that feels kind of historical fiction, fantasy kind of rolled into one. Ultimately, as I'm continuing to read on in the series, this feels like it's the prologue to the actual story that begins in book number 2. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's like a very condensed history where things are just rapid fire going from event to event. It's very refreshing. And then the real story kind of picks up in the second book. And I found that one to be almost, if not just as enjoyable as this first book. So yeah, Dandelion Dynasty needs all of the praise in the world, and I hope that it continues to fire up these lists over time as more people get a chance to read this wonderful, wonderful series. Next up is The Dragonbone Chair in that 9-way tie with 14 votes. This is book number 1 of 3 of Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams. And this is a very, very famous classic fantasy book. I read this recently and absolutely hated it. I DNF'd it at about 60% way. I gave it a 1 out of 5 stars, which I do when I DNF a book. It follows the story of Simon. This is a young kitchen boy and magician's apprentice whose dreams of great deeds and heroic wars all come to true when his world is torn apart by this terrifying civil war. It is insanely slow, but I'm told that it picks up, but it just took too long to get into the action for me to want to continue on with the series. So next up in that tie is 𝐵𝑒𝑟 𝐻𝑒𝑠𝑠i. This is a standalone that came out rather recently by Susanna Clark. I have not read this one, and though I plan to, I don't really have high hopes. It's about a man who's trapped in this unending labyrinth with rooms continuously being flooded by the ocean. His only companion aliens or the birds, thousands of statues, some skeletons, and this mysterious man he knows only as the Other. It just sounds like the entire book is like a fever dream style of writing, which are like my least favorite parts of fantasy books. So to have that is the core feature here, yeah, not a lot of hope for me. So also at number 71 is Lord of Chaos. This is book number 6 of 14 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This one is the most thrilling and action-packed installment up to that point. It makes for an absolutely wonderful fantasy book. It was the first time in the series that I legitimately was shell-shocked by the events that happened, and I had to put the book down to catch my breath, quite literally, before continuing. It's legitimately one of the best endings to any book that I've ever read, which is a very large statement for me when it comes to a fantasy genre that is known for having crazy endings. And I have read many hundreds of fantasy books, but that ending will always stick with me till the end of time. And if you're kind of being leery on this series, I do suggest that you at least read up to this point, unless you're like hating it, in which case, yeah, don't hate read anything. But yeah, this is when the series just pops off. Unfortunately, after that, it kind of goes into a lull for a little while. But yeah, this one is the last of the 9-way tie with 14 votes is Blood Song. This is book number 1 of 3 of Raven's Shadow by Anthony Ryan. Another one that I have not read, but it is on my TBR, and I'm very excited about reading it. This is an epic fantasy and exploring the themes of conflict, loyalty, and religious faith. The book tells the story of Vaylin Alsorna. This is a brother of the Sixth Order as he's trained from childhood as a warrior in service to the faith. And it is a debut book from this author. So yeah, I keep hearing things about this one in a positive light. And I think like when I started doing this, I heard about it and then like my brain's just picking up on it. It kind of reminds me of like when you're thinking about like buying a car or something, all of a sudden you can't stop seeing car commercials when normally they fade to the background. I think that may be what's happening here, but yeah, we'll see. Now, up to number 67, there is a 4-way tie with 15 votes, and the first is Red Rising. This is book number 1 of 3 of the first trilogy of the Red Rising, or maybe the only trilogy, because I think the next series here is like 4 or 5 books, but of that initial 3 books. This is by Pierce Brown. I initially gave this a 3.5 out of 5. It's this dystopian science fiction novel set in the future of Mars. It follows this lowborn miner Darrow as he infiltrates the ranks of the elite golds. It reads kind of more like an adult Hunger Games. And yeah, it was okay. I think I was being pretty generous with my rating when I rated it that. And if I read it again, I probably would rate it even lower. It just does not stick into my brain in any positive light. I mean, books kind of fall and rise over time with me as I have time to kind of think about them. And that's kind of the case here. So next up in that 4-way tie is Morningstar. This is the 3rd book of that first trilogy in the Red Rising. And of course, this is by Pierce Brown. So this is the final in that original Red Rising trilogy. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5, my highest score for any Red Rising book. I do not want to spoil anything here, so I won't really talk about it very much. But while I did not love the lead up to the final parts of this book, the ending was absolutely mind-blowingly perfect to me. And so much so that I kind of felt like the series should end on that note. It was the perfect ending. I don't want to say anything more than that. It didn't like tie up every loose end. I kind of hate fantasy stories that tie up everything, but it felt like a very natural conclusion. And yeah, just kind of wished it died off at that point. So third in this 4-way tie with 15 votes is Fool's Errand. Fool's Errand is the first of the 3rd trilogy in the realm of the Elderlings. This trilogy is called Tawny Man. This is by the one and only Robin Hobb, one of my very favorite authors. And I was rather worried going into this book, given that I did not love the book preceding this that involved this main character. So the book is kind of split up by trilogies. The first trilogy is kind of connected to the 3rd and the 5th. So I loved the 2nd trilogy, but the first one, I liked it, but the 3rd book was weak. So when this picks up again in that 3rd trilogy, I was like, okay, hopefully this gets going. And this was great. It was a super easy 5 out of 5 for me. It's extremely slow, maybe the slowest book that I've ever read, but I loved it. And I don't really normally love slow books, but Robin Hobb is just such a gifted gifted writer that I could read her write pretty much anything, and I'm going to fall in love with the writing. But I ended up really loving the story for what it was, and the way that information was presented. So last in this four-way tie at number 67 is 𝐒𝐮𝐥. This is a standalone book by Brandon Sanderson. I believe this is Sanderson's first published book, and it really reads that way, in a bad way. I gave this a very generous 2 stars. I almost did not finish the book due to how uninterested I was by the end of this. Thankfully, I went into this book after already reading Stormlight Chronicle and Mistborn, Stormlight Archive. Otherwise, I might have given up on Sanderson as an author. I'm very glad that I read this in the way that I did. I think a lot of people might read this one for the first, and then they're like, oh, Sanderson's not for me. But he got a lot better as an author. But in general, I find that I'm like the lowest on this book out of anybody that I know, so take that for what it's worth. This is so slow. It doesn't have anything like the suspense and the twists and the grand scale of his other works. And the romance aspect of this made me literally roll my eyes. So skip this unless you're this huge Sanderson fan and want to read all of his books. But otherwise start with Stormlight or Mistborn. At number 61 now, we have a 6-way tie. This is with 16 votes, and the first is The Silmarillion. This is a standalone by J.R.R. Tolkien, and standalone. I mean, it's within the Lord of the Rings universe, but yeah. I've not read this, surprisingly. It is a collection of myths and stories in various styles by Tolkien. It was edited and published posthumously by his son, Christopher, in 1977, assisted by fantasy author Guy Gavriel Kay. Now, I'm not a huge Lord of the Rings fan. I love the movies. I like the books, but I'm not obsessed with them as most other fantasy fans are. And it made me, not really interested in going into a book that I find almost everybody says is weaker than a trilogy that I didn't love. So, yeah, I'm probably not going to read this one, but maybe someday I will. Next up in that 6-way tie with 16 votes is The Dragon Reborn. This is book number 3 of 14 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. And this is the first really good book in The Wheel of Time for me. I gave it a 5 out of 5, the first one in the series that I gave a 5 out of 5. The pacing of this book was much more enjoyable, and the second half of this book is far more exciting. This is the first book in the series where the story really starts to take on that grand epic scale that the story is steadily marching the reader towards. And even though Rand, who is kind of the main character of this story, is definitely the main character of the book, I did appreciate that he had a smaller role in this book so that we could learn more about the other characters and get a feel for them more. And with a series this long, that is like a mandatory must. So yeah, really liked that it went in that direction and probably influenced other books to kind of do the same kind of style. So next up in that 6-way tie is Jade War. This is book number 2 of 3 of the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. I think we already talked about the first in the Greenbone Saga. This is the next one. This fantasy mafia story only gets better in the second volume as it strays further and further from The Godfather and does its own thing. I gave this a super easy 5 out of 5. It takes the foundation from that first book, the foundation that made it so great, but it doesn't need that slow character development that was needed in that first book. And it really got into the flow of the story, and it really made me fall in love with these characters even more than I did in that first book. Next up in that 6-way tie is Golden Sun. This is book number 2 of 3 of the first trilogy in Red Rising. This is by Pierce Brown. A lot of Red Rising today. This second book is in the trilogy is probably the most different second book from a first book that I've ever encountered. It felt like the series was finally kind of starting to hit its stride and tell this grander story that was kind of being teased out in the first book. At the time, I gave it a 4 out of 5. In retrospect, I think that was a little bit generous. Don't really want to go into too much specifics about why this book was so different. But if you didn't really love the first book, I do think you should give this one a try because of how different it really is. Next up in that six-way tie for number 61 is The Gathering Storm. This is book number 12 of 14 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. So at this point, Robert Jordan had passed away. Brandon Sanderson took over the series by using Robert Jordan's notes. I came into this series very late on after they were all done, so I had the benefit of already knowing who Brandon Sanderson is, who is one of my favorite authors, and he did a wonderful job of closing out those last few books. But I feel like a lot of people undersold just how monumental of a task that he knocked this out of the park, and how hard that would have been to take up a series that was beloved and keep up the same tone while also putting your own influences in it. Differences that I thought made the series even better. This book is a fantastic from start to finish, and the fact that he was so seamlessly able to pick up a series that had a dozen large books written before this is nothing short of remarkable. And yeah, a very easy 5 out of 5 stars for me. And the last of this six-way tie with number 61 is The Fifth Season. This is book number 1 of 3 of The Broken Earth by N.K. Jemisin. And this is a 1-star read for me. It's one of the worst reading experiences that I've ever had in my entire life. I hated almost every single thing about this book. I have ranted about this book many times before on this channel. I'm not going to subject you to that rant again, but needless to say, I hate it. And if you love it, more power to you. I just wish I was in the same boat as you. I don't really get why you do, but look, I love some books that most people hate. So more power to you. I'm happy for you. Not for me. So that is it for these 20. I'm going to try to get my next video in this series out next week, but who knows? These take a little bit of time to prep, and so I can't commit myself to doing it weekly, but I will do my best to get it out next week. Thank you so much for watching this. Please feel free to leave a comment, but an even better way to get a hold of me is through Discord. Hit the link down below. Sadly, I'm getting so many comments on my YouTube videos that it's becoming very impossible for me to respond to all of them, but I do respond to everything on Discord, so check me out there. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to all my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier and Librarian tier patrons: Anna G, Brian, CJ, Darren, Jonathan, My Book is Lit, Nathan T, Nev's Book Channel, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L, Anna, Andra, Angelo, Ben, Blair, Brock, Evan, Jen B, Harry B, Jamie, Jeff Pixler, Maria, Michael Sugarman, Sky, TW57, Wacky, and Zion.